August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, Japan. The morning begins quietly. The Ota River moves without sound through the center of Hiroshima, its surface unbroken, reflecting pale summer light. Streetcars rattle along narrow tracks. Shopkeepers lift wooden shutters. Children walk toward school in thin cotton uniforms, their lunchboxes swinging gently at their sides. The war feels distant here, far to the south, far across the ocean. At 8:15 a.m., the sky splits open. A white flash erupts above the city, brighter than the sun, hotter than any furnace ever built. In a single instant, shadows are burned into stone, roof tiles liquefy, human bodies vanish where they stand. The air itself becomes fire. Then comes silence. For several seconds there is no sound at all, no wind, no voices, only a vast rising cloud where a city had been. When sound returns, it is the sound of collapse. Buildings folding inward, fires igniting everywhere at once, water boiling in the rivers, a city of 300,000 reduced to scattered motion among ashes and smoke. No one yet understands what has happened. No one yet has words for it. But within hours, men with cameras will begin to arrive. Japanese doctors, military officers, later American survey teams. They will lift lenses toward a landscape that barely resembles the Earth. And in those first photographs, blurred, scorched, incomplete, the world will see something it has never seen before. The aftermath of a single weapon, and the beginning of a new age. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War had entered its sixth and final year. Across Europe, the conflict was already over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally in May. Berlin lay in ruins. The armies of the Reich were disarmed and dispersed. The long continental war that had consumed tens of millions of lives had finally ended. But in the Pacific, the war still burned with relentless intensity. Imperial Japan, isolated and battered, continued to fight with a determination that astonished even its enemies. Its navy had been shattered. Its merchant fleet lay mostly at the bottom of the sea. Its cities were already burning. Yet the Japanese government showed no clear sign of surrender. For the United States and its allies, the problem was no longer how to defeat Japan, but how many more lives it would cost to force the end. By early 1945, American planners were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, was scheduled to begin in November. Intelligence estimates predicted hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. Some projections reached into the millions, counting both soldiers and civilians. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had already offered a grim preview. On Iwo Jima, more than 6,000 Americans were killed to capture 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison died fighting to the last man. On Okinawa, the slaughter was worse. Over 12,000 American soldiers were killed. More than 100,000 Japanese troops perished. Civilian casualties reached staggering levels. As families were drawn into the fighting, some coerced into suicide rather than surrender. The message seemed unmistakable. If Japan were invaded, the resistance would be total. While bombers reduced Japanese cities night after night, American leaders searched for a way to end the war without destroying both armies in a final bloodbath. Unbeknownst to the public, a solution had already been under construction for nearly 3 years. In August 1942, under the strictest secrecy, the United States had launched the Manhattan Project, an unprecedented scientific and industrial effort to build a weapon based on the newly discovered power of nuclear fission. The project drew together more than 100,000 workers, physicists, chemists, engineers, machinists. Entire secret cities were built while in Tennessee, New Mexico, and Washington state. At Los Alamos, in the desert highlands, scientists raced to solve problems no one had ever solved before. How to split the atom in a controlled explosion, how to shape invisible forces into a weapon, how to calculate blast, heat, and radiation. By July 1945, the effort succeeded. On July 16th, in the New Mexico desert, the first atomic device was detonated in a test known as Trinity. The explosion lit the mountains for miles. The shock wave knocked observers to the ground. The mushroom cloud climbed into the stratosphere. The weapon worked. President Harry Truman, attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received the news quietly. He now possessed a force unlike any in human history. The question was no longer whether the bomb could be used, but where and how. A special target committee had already selected possible cities. The criteria were precise. The target had to be large enough to demonstrate the bomb's power. It had to contain military or industrial value. It had to be relatively undamaged by previous bombing, so the effects could be clearly measured. Kyoto was considered, then removed, spared for its cultural significance. Hiroshima remained, a port city on the delta of 6 rivers, headquarters of the Japanese Second Army, a logistics center for southern Japan, and crucially, almost untouched by the massive firebombing that had already destroyed Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other cities. On Tinian Island, in the Mariana Chain, a specially modified B-29 bomber waited on the runway. Its name was painted on the nose in dark letters, Enola Gay. The crew trained in secrecy. They rehearsed flight paths, bomb release procedures, escape maneuvers. They were told the weapon was powerful, but not precisely how powerful. In the early hours of August 6, 1945, the aircraft lifted off into the darkness and turned northwest toward Japan. Inside its bomb bay hung a single device, 6 feet long, weighing nearly 5 tons. Its code name was Little Boy. As the bomber crossed the coast of Honshu and climbed toward its bombing altitude, the city of Hiroshima lay below, unaware that it had been selected as the proving ground for a new age of warfare. And soon, in less than an hour, a single point in the sky would change the history of the world and leave behind images that no one would ever forget. At 7:09 a.m., Hiroshima's air raid sirens sounded briefly, then fell silent. A small formation of American aircraft had appeared on radar, then turned away. The city's defenders, accustomed now to constant false alarms, issued the all clear. Workers returned to factories. School children were sent into the streets to clear fire breaks between wooden houses. Doctors resumed morning rounds. High above them, nearly 31,000 feet in the air, the Enola Gay approached from the south. Colonel Paul Tibbets sat at the controls. Beside him, Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee lay flat behind the Norden bomb site, staring down through drifting clouds at the maze of rivers and bridges below. The aiming point was the Aioi Bridge, a distinctive T-shaped span near the city center. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, Farabee released the bomb. Little Boy fell for 43 seconds. At 600 meters above the city, it detonated. The explosion did not sound like thunder. There was no roar at first, only a blinding pulse of light, brighter than magnesium, brighter than the sun at noon. The flash was visible hundreds of kilometers away. In the first fraction of a second, The temperature at the center of the blast reached several million degrees. Stone vaporized, steel warped like wax, human skin ignited before nerves could register pain. A sphere of fire expanded outward at supersonic speed. Within 1 second, it had reached a radius of more than 1 kilometer. Wooden buildings burst into flame. Roofs were ripped from frames. Glass shattered in every direction, embedding itself into walls and flesh. Then, the pressure wave arrived. Air compressed and slammed into the city with hurricane force, flattening structures that had survived the heat. Concrete walls cracked and collapsed. Streetcars were hurled from their tracks. People were lifted, spun, and thrown into debris. Within minutes, a column of smoke and dust began to rise. Heated air surged upward, drawing in winds from every direction. Fires merged into a single rotating inferno. A firestorm that consumed entire neighborhoods and suffocated those who had survived the initial blast. At the hypocenter, beneath the point of detonation, almost nothing remained standing. Hospitals vanished, schools disappeared. The headquarters of the Second Army collapsed into rubble. Of the city's 90,000 buildings, more than 60,000 were destroyed or severely damaged. Communication ended almost instantly. Telegraph lines melted. Telephone exchanges burned. Radio stations went silent. From Tokyo, military headquarters tried repeatedly to contact Hiroshima and received no reply. By mid-morning, reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to investigate. Pilots reported a single massive cloud hanging over the city, still climbing, still spreading. Beneath it, an entire urban center appeared erased. On the ground, survivors wandered through streets they no longer recognized. Skin hung in strips from burned arms. Hair fell out in clumps. Many were blind. Many were mute with shock. Rivers filled with bodies. Those who had jumped in to escape the flames, and those who had already died. Doctors who reached the ruins found something unfamiliar. Patients with no visible injuries collapsed hours later and began vomiting uncontrollably. Purple spots appeared under the skin. Gums bled. Fevers rose without infection. No one yet understood radiation sickness, but it was already spreading through the city. By evening, Japanese authorities realized that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb, a weapon of extraordinary power. Within days, another atomic device would fall on Nagasaki. And on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito would announce Japan's surrender to the world. But before surrender came occupation. Before reconstruction came investigation. And before memory came images. Because in the hours and days that followed the blast, as smoke still rose from the ruins and bodies still lay unburied, the first cameras were already being prepared to record what no one had ever recorded before, a city after the atom. The first men to enter Hiroshima after the explosion did not come as conquerors. They came as survivors, doctors from nearby towns, soldiers sent to search for command posts that no longer existed, railway workers trying to find tracks beneath the ash, and civilians walking back toward neighborhoods that had vanished, calling the names of children, parents, wives, into a silence that did not answer. In the center of the city, where the flash had burned brightest, the ground was still warm to the touch. Shadows lay fixed on walls. The outlines of ladders, bicycles, human figures burned permanently into stone. In places, nothing remained at all, only smooth patches of pale earth where heat had erased every trace of life. Hospitals that still stood filled instantly. Doctors worked without electricity, without water, without medicine. Burns covered entire bodies, Clothing had fused to skin, eyelashes were gone, eyes were swollen shut. Many victims did not scream. Their throats were too damaged. Within hours, a second wave of illness began to appear. Men and women who seemed lightly injured collapsed suddenly. They vomited dark fluid. Their hair loosened and fell out. Bleeding began from gums and noses. Purple bruises spread across unbroken skin. Physicians recorded symptoms they had never seen before, unable to explain why patients with no burns were dying as quickly as those with terrible wounds. In makeshift shelters, children lay beside strangers. Parents searched among rows of blackened bodies, lifting arms, turning faces, trying to recognize what fire had reshaped. Cremation pits burned day and night. The smell of smoke mixed with a smell of flesh. This was the human angle of the bomb, the part that no blueprint had calculated. At the same time, a different kind of examination was beginning. Japanese military engineers moved cautiously through the ruins, measuring distances, mapping destruction patterns, trying to understand the nature of the weapon that had done this. They noted that buildings directly beneath the blast had collapsed vertically, while structures farther away leaned outward as if pressed flat by invisible hands. They studied shattered steel beams bent at impossible angles. They collected fragments of glass, fused with sand into greenish lumps. They marked zones where nothing living had survived. Above all, they tried to estimate yield. From blast radius and thermal damage, they concluded that the bomb's power exceeded anything previously imagined, equivalent to thousands of tons of high explosive. No conventional air raid, no matter how large, could have produced this pattern. Meanwhile, scientists in the United States were making their own calculations. At Los Alamos, theoretical predictions were being compared against early reconnaissance reports. Shockwave velocities, heat radiation curves, firestorm dynamics. Hiroshima was no longer only a city. It had become a full-scale laboratory. But the most fragile angle was the one no one yet fully understood. Radiation, invisible, odorless, delayed. Doctors noticed that many patients who survived burns died days later without infection. White blood cell counts dropped sharply. Bone marrow failed. Pregnant women miscarried. Infants were born weak and malformed months later. At the time, even the word radiation sickness was not widely used. Some Japanese physicians suspected poison gas. Others believed it was a lingering effect of heat. American military doctors would later arrive with Geiger counters and film badges, measuring exposure levels, documenting decay rates, trying to map the invisible boundary between survival and death. 3 perspectives: human suffering, medical mystery, technological astonishment, converged in the same ruined streets. And then another angle arrived. Men carrying cameras. Some were Japanese journalists, moving quietly, photographing what remained of hospitals and schools. Others were military officers ordered to document damage for official reports. None yet knew that their images would become some of the most important photographs ever taken. Because soon, from across the ocean, a new force was approaching. Not with bombs, but with clipboards, uniforms, and orders to record everything. The first photographs of Hiroshima were taken in silence. Japanese photographers arrived within days, carrying bulky cameras through fields of ash and broken tile. Some were employees of local newspapers that no longer had buildings. Others were military technicians, assigned to create visual records for internal reports. They worked carefully, conserving film, choosing angles that showed collapsed bridges, burned hospitals, and rows of unburied dead along the riverbanks. Many of these early images were never published. Censorship began almost immediately. Japanese authorities feared panic and feared the humiliation of showing the empire's vulnerability. Negatives were collected, sealed, and stored. Some would not be seen again for decades. When American forces entered Hiroshima in September 1945, photography became systematic. Units of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey arrived with engineers, doctors, and camera crews. Their mission was not symbolic, it was analytical. They were ordered to measure destruction, calculate casualties, and determine precisely what an atomic bomb did to a modern city. Army photographers moved methodically through the ruins. They photographed flattened neighborhoods from rooftops that somehow still stood. They recorded steel frames twisted like paper. They documented burned tram cars, collapsed schools, and the skeletal dome of the Industrial Promotion Hall, one of the few structures still standing near the hypocenter. They photographed survivors, men with faces wrapped in bandages, women whose arms were completely scarred, children sitting alone among ruins, staring at nothing. In hospital wards, cameras lingered on blistered skin and hairless scalps, on bandaged limbs and hollow eyes. Some of these images were taken with clinical detachment. Others, accidentally, captured something else. Confusion, shame, grief. But almost none of them reached the public. Under occupation rules, all material related to atomic damage was classified. Newspapers were forbidden to print photographs or discuss radiation effects. Doctors were instructed not to publish findings without approval. Survivors were discouraged from speaking openly about their symptoms. For years, the world saw only what the American government chose to release. Official photographs emphasized empty landscapes, destroyed factories, military targets, a city without people. Images of burned civilians, dying children, and long-term illness remained locked in filing cabinets in Tokyo and Washington. Behind closed doors, however, another conversation was beginning. Among scientists who had built the bomb, doubt spread quickly. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of Los Alamos, later recalled that, after Hiroshima, many physicists felt they had crossed a line they could not return from. Some spoke openly about guilt. Others warned that nuclear weapons would inevitably spread and eventually be used again. Military officers, too, were divided. Some believed the bomb had saved lives by preventing an invasion. Others quietly questioned whether Japan had already been close to surrender and whether such destruction had been necessary. Journalists who glimpsed the classified photographs were shaken. One American correspondent later wrote that no training had prepared him for a city where nothing living remained. And among the survivors themselves, a deeper reckoning unfolded. Hibakusha, the people exposed to the blast, were often shunned. Employers feared contamination. Families worried about genetic damage. Many concealed their injuries and their past, living quietly with scars that never healed. For them, the photographs were not history. They were proof. Proof that what they had seen was real. Proof that the world had changed in one morning. And slowly, as occupation censorship weakened and documents were declassified, those images began to surface. First in scientific journals, then in exhibitions, then in magazines read by millions. Photographs that showed shadows burned onto walls, children with bandaged faces, a city flattened beyond recognition. Images that no longer belonged to any nation, only to history. And as those images spread across the world, they forced a final confrontation, not only with the aftermath of the bomb, but with the moment it was born. The instant when one weapon, one decision, and one flash of light changed everything. They entered the city slowly. In the days after the surrender announcement, long before formal occupation began, small Japanese survey teams moved into the heart of Hiroshima under military escort. Their task was simple in description and overwhelming in reality: record what remained. The roads were still blocked by collapsed buildings. In many places, there were no roads at all, only open fields of ash where neighborhoods had stood. Charred telephone poles leaned at odd angles, their wires trailing across the ground like vines. The smell of burned wood had faded, replaced by something heavier, metallic, and sweet. At the hypocenter, near the ruins of the Shima Hospital, the destruction formed a perfect circle. Everything inside it had been crushed downward. Stone foundations were stripped bare. Tile roofs had disintegrated into dust. Even shadows seemed anchored to the ground, unmoving reminders of people who had stood there seconds before the flash. Photographers worked carefully. They framed the broken dome of the Industrial Promotion Hall against the empty sky. They crouched to photograph lunchboxes melted into pavement. They focused on the blackened silhouettes of stair railings burned into concrete. Each click of the shutter preserved something that would never exist again. Doctors accompanied them. In makeshift clinics built from scrap lumber, they examined patients who had survived the firestorm, only to begin dying weeks later. Skin lesions spread across arms and backs. Hair loss continued. White blood cell counts dropped to nearly zero. The doctors wrote notes by hand, sketching symptoms in margins, trying to build the first medical record of atomic disease. One physician later described the city as a vast, open wound. The dead were still everywhere. Thousands had been buried hastily in shallow pits. Others lay in collapsed houses, uncollected, their remains indistinguishable from rubble. Rainstorms washed ash into the rivers, carrying bones and fragments downstream. In September, the first American advance parties arrived. They came not with weapons raised, but with notebooks and cameras. Members of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey stepped cautiously through the ruins, measuring blast shadows, tracing fire patterns, marking distances from the hypocenter with chalk and flags. They interviewed survivors through interpreters. Where were you standing? What did you see first? Light, heat, or wind? How long before the fires reached your street? Their questions were precise, detached, designed to turn human memory into data. Army photographers followed closely. They photographed everything. Collapsed bridges twisted sideways. A schoolyard where only concrete steps remained. A clock stopped at 8:15. Its glass fused into the dial. Hospital wards filled with silent patients wrapped in gauze. In one series of images, a man sits alone on a pile of bricks, staring at a photograph of his family, the edges burned away. In another, children line up for water at a pump that barely works, their backs covered in scars shaped like branches. But these images were not yet meant for the world. Each roll of film was labeled, logged, and shipped under guard. Prints were reviewed by military censors. Photographs showing extreme injury or civilian suffering were often removed from circulation. The official record emphasized structures, damage zones, industrial targets. Yet behind the statistics, the evidence was unmistakable. This was not a battlefield. It was a city, and the weapon that destroyed it had done something no weapon had ever done before. Erased not only buildings and armies, but time itself, freezing a single moment forever in ash, shadow, and film. As more survey teams arrived and the archive of images grew, a realization began to spread quietly through both Japanese and American observers. These photographs were no longer only documentation. They were testimony, and testimony, once recorded, would eventually demand an audience. By late September 1945, Hiroshima had become the most carefully studied ruin on Earth. American occupation headquarters established restricted zones around the hypocenter. Survey tents rose among the rubble. Trucks arrived daily carrying engineers, physicists, medical officers, and photographers. What had once been a living city was now an open-air laboratory. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey expanded its work. Teams mapped concentric rings of destruction, marking where wooden houses had burned completely, where brick structures had collapsed, where reinforced concrete had barely survived. They measured scorch marks on walls and traced the direction of shattered glass to reconstruct the shape of the blast wave. Every detail mattered. Because the next war, if it came, would be nuclear. The photographers moved with them. Some carried 35mm cameras. Others used large format equipment mounted on tripods. They photographed from rooftops, from riverbanks, from inside buildings that still smelled faintly of smoke. They recorded panoramas of flattened districts and close-ups of steel beams bent like ribbon. And increasingly, they turned their lenses toward people. In temporary clinics, American medical officers documented radiation injuries in a systematic way. They photographed burns in different stages of healing. They recorded hair loss, skin discoloration, ulcerated wounds that refused to close. Each image was numbered, catalogued, attached to patient files. In one widely preserved series, a young woman sits on a wooden stool, her back turned to the camera. Across her shoulders and arms, dark scars form a branching pattern, the imprint of the kimono she'd been wearing when the heat pulse burned through fabric and skin alike. In another, a boy stands naked against a white wall, his ribs visible, his scalp nearly bald, eyes staring straight into the lens. These were not portraits. They were evidence. At the same time, Japanese photographers continued their own work, often quietly, sometimes secretly. They documented funeral pyres, crowded shelters, and families rebuilding huts from scrap lumber. They photographed the Industrial Promotion Hall again and again, its skeletal dome becoming a symbol even before the word memorial was spoken. But control over these images was tightening. In October 1945, the occupation authorities issued strict press codes. Any reference to radiation was forbidden. Photographs showing human suffering from the atomic bomb were banned from publication. Even medical journals were censored. Thousands of negatives were confiscated. Japanese doctors who tried to publish case studies were warned. Newspapers that printed survivor accounts had articles removed before distribution. The story of Hiroshima was being shaped. Not denied, but narrowed, simplified, made safer. To the outside world, the atomic bomb was presented as a powerful but clean weapon. Official releases showed aerial photographs of the city before and after the blast. Maps of damage zones, empty streets, collapsed factories. The victims themselves were largely invisible. Inside American military archives, however, the full record grew heavier each month. By early 1946, more than 20,000 photographs and reels of film had been collected from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They filled filing cabinets in Tokyo, Washington, and New Mexico. Some were classified as secret, others as restricted. Very few were accessible even to senior officers. Among those who saw them, reactions were profound. General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, reportedly found some images disturbing, but insisted they demonstrated military success. Other officers privately admitted that the photographs unsettled them more than any battlefield scene they had witnessed. For the scientists, the effect was deeper still. When selected images were shown at Los Alamos, several physicists later recalled long silences in the room. They recognized in the scars and ruins the mathematical curves they themselves had calculated on chalkboards. The equations had worked. And this was the result. Yet the public knew almost nothing. In 1946 and 1947, when American magazines finally published atomic bomb stories, they relied mostly on aerial views and technical diagrams. A few carefully chosen ground photographs appeared, but rarely showed faces, rarely showed burns, rarely showed children. It was not until 1952, 7 years after the explosion, that Life magazine published the first major photo essay revealing the human aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By then, many of the original victims were already dead. When those images finally appeared, they shocked readers around the world. Not because the cities were destroyed. That was expected in war. But because the destruction had been so silent, so instant, so complete. And because, for the first time, the public could see what nuclear war did, not only to buildings, but to skin, to bone, to memory. The release of those photographs marked a turning point. From that moment on, the atomic bomb was no longer only a strategic weapon. It was a human event. And with that realization, the world entered a new and uncertain era, one in which the images of Hiroshima would stand forever as both record and warning. As the archives slowly opened and survivors began to speak more freely, the final chapter of the story was only beginning. Not the chapter of destruction, but the chapter of consequences. By September 1945, Hiroshima was a city transformed beyond recognition. 300,000 people had lived there before the bomb. After the explosion, estimates suggest that between 70,000 and 80,000 were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks and months from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. Entire families vanished. Streets once bustling with children, merchants, and trams were now open fields of ash and rubble. The survivors faced an unrelenting struggle. Food and water were scarce. Rice stores had been destroyed or contaminated. Wells were blocked by debris or overflowed with the remains of buildings and people. For weeks, doctors worked with minimal supplies, improvising with medicines scavenged from ruins, local herbs, and any remaining bandages. Hospitals, many of which had collapsed or burned, could accommodate only a fraction of the wounded. Makeshift clinics appeared in temples, schools, and open courtyards. Physicians, nurses, and volunteers faced patients whose injuries they had never encountered. Burns that penetrated deeply into muscle, radiation ulcers that resisted all treatment, hair falling in clumps, and fragile children who cried without energy. Civilians organized as best they could. Neighbors helped neighbors, fire brigades, reduced in number by the blast. Coordinated efforts to prevent remaining buildings from igniting. Streets were cleared of debris. Temporary shelters were built from corrugated tin, bamboo, and salvaged wood. Yet the psychological toll was immense. Many survivors, or hibakusha, walked through the ashes in shock, unable to process what had happened. Eyes, ears, and minds had recorded a sudden, incomprehensible event. People described the sky as brighter than the sun, the city folding in on itself, and the heat burning through clothing and flesh before the sound of the blast reached them. Memories of these moments would haunt them for decades. Bodies were still everywhere. Families were unable to bury their dead. Rivers carried the remains of the fallen downstream, mingling with floating debris. Smoke rose constantly from small fires across the city, mingling with dust and ash, creating a hazy horizon. Relief efforts were slow, and many survivors scavenged for food and water themselves. Medical teams tried to make sense of what they saw. Radiation sickness presented a mystery. Some patients with minimal burns fell critically ill within hours or days. Doctors recorded fevers, vomiting, hemorrhaging, and hair loss. Early studies were fragmented, hampered by the destruction of records and facilities. Yet the patterns were clear. Even those who escaped the immediate blast were not safe. Japanese authorities tried to maintain order. Local officials attempted to coordinate relief, distribute food, and assess damage. Reports describe a city struggling to function under near total collapse. Bridges, roads, and communication lines were destroyed. The Second Army headquarters had disappeared. Command structures broke down entirely. Amid this chaos, the first Japanese photographs began circulating within official channels. They documented collapsed buildings, rivers littered with debris, and burned out factories. Some images captured the first faces of the survivors. Children and adults, bandaged and wandering among ruins. Others showed the shadows burned into walls, a silent testament to those who had perished instantly. These photographs served multiple purposes. They were evidence of destruction, a tool for assessing the city's damage. They were also documentation of civilian suffering, though initially intended only for internal review. Censored or withheld from the public, these images preserve details that would later allow historians to reconstruct the immediate aftermath of the atomic bomb. And in the background, American occupation forces prepared to enter the city. They would conduct surveys, take further photographs, and begin cataloging Hiroshima for the world. But for the survivors, the struggle was immediate, tangible, and relentless. Not in archives or photographs, but in hunger, injury, and the search for lost family. The story of Hiroshima had shifted from instantaneous destruction to survival. And the images that captured this survival would eventually bridge the gap between local suffering and global consciousness. By late 1945 and early 1946, the full extent of Hiroshima's destruction remained largely hidden from the global public. Occupation authorities in Japan controlled all access to photographs and reports. The U.S. military's Strategic Bombing Survey had amassed tens of thousands of images, film reels, and technical records, yet most remained classified. Photographs showing severe burns, children or civilians, were deemed too sensitive for release. The official narrative emphasized industrial targets and strategic outcomes, not human suffering. Behind closed doors, however, the discussion was intense. Scientists who had developed the bomb reviewed the surveys and photographs. They noted the efficiency of destruction and the unprecedented scale of the firestorm. Yet many were disturbed by what they saw. Shadows burned into stone, children with faces unrecognizably scarred, hospitals emptied of life. These images were undeniable evidence that Hiroshima was not just a military target, but a human catastrophe. Gradually, some materials were declassified. By 1946, selected aerial photographs and limited ground images were made available to military historians and select journalists. Still, the images of civilian suffering remained largely hidden. In Japan, survivors were advised not to speak publicly about their injuries or the effects of radiation. Hibakusha were often stigmatized, facing social and occupational discrimination. It was not until the early 1950s that the world began to see Hiroshima as it truly was after the bomb. In 1952, Life magazine published a photo essay showing the city's devastation, the skeletal dome of the Industrial Promotion Hall, burned out schools, and children scarred by burns. The images shocked readers worldwide. Unlike conventional wartime photography, these images captured a silence as profound as the destruction itself. Streets appeared empty of life, yet human suffering was evident in burned clothing, abandoned homes, and the faint outlines of shadows left on walls. The photographs also became the cornerstone for historical understanding of nuclear warfare. Scholars and journalists studied them to map the effects of blast radius, thermal radiation, and firestorms. Medical researchers referenced images alongside hospital records to track acute and long-term effects of radiation exposure. Urban planners and military analysts used them to simulate the consequences of nuclear strikes on other cities. Beyond technical study, these images carried moral weight. They raised questions about the use of nuclear weapons that remain unsettled today. Survivors' faces, immortalized on film, reminded the world that the atomic bomb was not simply a strategic tool, but an instrument that inflicted indiscriminate suffering. International debates over nuclear policy, arms control, and humanitarian law often referenced the photographic record of Hiroshima as irrefutable proof of the stakes. The images also helped preserve memory. Communities of survivors began to use the photographs in exhibitions and educational programs. Museums and memorials in Hiroshima displayed the earliest photographs alongside testimonies, helping ensure that future generations understood both the scale of destruction and the human cost. By the late 20th century, the images had become symbols of warning and remembrance. They illustrated what a nuclear strike could do to a city and its population. They testified not only to the power of the atomic bomb, but to the resilience and courage of the survivors, many of whom rebuilt homes, families, and a city from ashes. Through these photographs, the story of Hiroshima moved from the classified reports of military archives to the collective consciousness of humanity. And as the city rose again from ruin, the photographs remained, silent witnesses to a moment when one flash of light forever altered the course of history. From destruction came documentation. From documentation, reflection. The images of Hiroshima do not speak in words. They speak in silence, in shadows burned into walls, in streets emptied of life, in the twisted skeletons of buildings that once held laughter, commerce, and community. They are records of a moment when technology, human decision, and circumstance converged to produce something unprecedented, a single weapon capable of annihilating a city in seconds. Yet the photographs are more than evidence. They are witnesses. They allow us to see what no map, no report, no statistic could fully convey. They capture human vulnerability, the fragility of life in the face of forces we create but cannot entirely control. They record both suffering and survival, despair and resilience. In every blurred face, every charred outline. They remind us that history is made not only in strategy rooms and laboratories, but in the streets where people live and die. Over the decades, these images have shaped memory, policy, and conscience. They informed debates over nuclear proliferation. They educated generations about the consequences of war. They inspired memorials and peace movements in Japan and around the world. And yet, they do not offer closure. They leave questions open about moral responsibility, about the limits of technology, about what it means to wield power without precedent. But in their silence, they demand attention. They insist that we remember, that we reckon, that we bear witness. Hiroshima was not just destroyed, it was documented. And through those photographs, the city endures. A testament to the cost of human ambition, the fragility of civilization, and the enduring need to confront the consequences of our own creations. Even as the city rose again from ashes, the photographs remain eternal, silent, truthful, a mirror for the world, reflecting the darkest instant of one summer morning, and the fragile hope that humanity might choose differently next time.